Following the poetic retelling of the Watcher Angel myth that I recorded in two parts previously, I thought it would be helpful to people if I quoted several of the sections from Enoch I, the Ethiopic Enoch, directly to give you an idea of how much may have been reworded, or specifically how little was actually rewarded. In most cases, what I did to produce that document was to tighten, select key phrases, but not change any of the details as they are presented in the works that are all the source materials for this. So the main text that we're working from is the Book of Enoch the Prophet. This is the one by R.H. Charles, and it was translated first in 1893. For many, many years it remained one of the, if not the, definitive translation of Ethiopic Enoch. And more recently in 2004, Nickelsburg and Vanderkam produced another version of this translation based primarily off of the Ethiopic Enoch, but they also integrate fragments of the Watcher Angel tale that can be found in the Qumran manuscripts, and they also integrate a couple of other things, a Syriac fragment and several others. Over here in chapter 12 of the Book of Enoch the Prophet, actually it's 14 where we will start. 14:3. As he hath created and given to man the power of understanding the word of wisdom, so hath he created me also, and given me the power of reprimanding the watchers, the children of heaven. This is Enoch speaking. I wrote out your petition, and in my vision it appeared thus, that your petition will not be granted unto you throughout all the days of eternity, and that judgment has been finally passed upon you. Yea, your petition will not be granted. And from henceforth you shall not ascend into heaven unto all eternity, and in bonds of the earth the decree has gone forth to bind you for all the days of the world. And that previously you shall have seen the destruction of your beloved sons, and you shall have no pleasure in them, but they shall fall before you by the sword. And your petition on their behalf shall not be granted, nor yet on your own, even though you weep and pray and speak all the words contained in the writing which I have written. And the vision was shown to me thus. And this is where Enoch then describes his trip into heaven, what heaven looked like, or at least what the mansions of heaven looked like, and then his conversation with the power of the throne, which is to say, the great glory, the Lord of ages, the Lord of generations, or quite simply, God. Here in 15, 1 through 12, and then 16, we get a kind of an Enoch I view of this decree of judgment from the throne of the Almighty. And this is word for word out of the Charles translation. And he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou righteous man and scribe of righteousness. Approach hither and hear my voice. And go, say to the watchers of heaven who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourself with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons? And though ye were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of the flesh. And, as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also who die and perish. Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them, and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on earth. But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you. For as the spiritual ones of heaven, in heaven is their dwelling place. And now the giants, who are produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, And from the holy watchers, they shall be evil spirits on earth, evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling, but as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men, and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here are sections that repeat, some phrases that are very repetitive. This is highly common in biblical texts as well as in texts that are related to the biblical tradition. And quite simply, while a scholarly argument of parallelism as part of the text can be made in some cases where, since many of these things began as an oral tradition and were part of a recitative tradition where it was spoken out loud. So to remind people of key points, you would have certain phrases repeated and parallel passages to make sure that those points were remembered most by the people listening to the recitation. There are certain sections that, quite simply put, are repetitive only because of scribal error, where someone was copying down an old copy and someone had written in the margins, or they were compiling copies from multiple sources of the same story, where there are multiple versions. Because these texts were considered sacred, when a scribe was acting as a copyist, it was not his place to question what it was he was copying. It was not his place to edit. Therefore, if he was looking at two different versions of the same text, and it was his job to put them together so that they were recorded because the previous versions were too old that they were deteriorating. If one of them repeated the same phrase in a slightly different way, one thing that would probably be done is he would write the first version from the first text, and where it would vary in the second one, he would write that down again. So there are, let's face it, even if you want to accept that books in the biblical tradition are divinely inspired, they are still recorded by humanity, and people are flawed. Our ability to remember, to record, is flawed, and the process of copying and handing things down over centuries, if not millennia, inevitably means that there are errors that will sneak into the texts. This is one of the reasons why you will have, if you look very carefully in the book of Genesis, simply look at the creation story itself. Do yourself a favor, take a notebook, go down Genesis for the parts where it talks about where God creates the world. You will find, if you keep track of on what day he created what, there are two versions in Genesis of the order in which God created the world. Notably, there was a time when Israel was split between northern and southern, and there was a unification. That unification involved merging the cults, the religious traditions of two different gods, Yahweh and Elohim. If you had access to the origin of the English translation of the Bible that most of us listening to this would be looking at, you will see, or you would see, Yahweh and Elohim used in different parts of these stories. Yahweh was one God. Elohim is actually a plural term. So there's a lot of textual evidence to indicate that these traditions are more complicated than we assume they are from a superficial reading of an English translation that has been polished and perhaps even whitewashed, or prepared for us in such a way that it removes question, doubt, or things that really glaringly conflict. In some cases, there are still glaring parts that conflict, and we're so accustomed to reading them that we don't question why in one section God tells David to take a census, and in another section of the Bible, the same story David takes a census, and God gets really angry at him for doing it. On one hand, it reflects people who were okay with David taking a census, and on the other hand, it reflects the people who were definitely not okay. I think that it's a mistake. No, it is a mistake, straight up. It is a mistake for any of the biblical stuff to be approached as inarguable, infallible, absolutely perfect and unflawed, even if you wish to accept the notion that in some way this is inspired by a higher power. Never forget that it must pass through the prism of humanity, then through the refracted lens of multiple languages, multiple translations, and then somehow survive over time and multiple copies to us. You're looking at thousands of years of transmission. It's really a wonder that the stories retain cohesion at all. So, sorry if I got a little off onto a bit of a soapbox there, but we see this a lot with the Book of Enoch. The multiple versions that we have tell us slightly different versions of the story. One of the primary places where we will see a lot of conflicting evidence in these texts will be the names of the angels. Certain names remain the same throughout. Azazel in various recognizable forms, Shemyaza in various recognizable forms. But many of the other players who are identified as watchers, their names are not as consistent from section to section. Since I'm running a little bit low on time here, I'm going to move on to another episode where we will look at specifically in only this version of the Book of Enoch and talk about the section where it identifies the Watchers and their chiefs of 10. Because it's very interesting. There are 2 versions of this story that appear in this book alone. So always question, always check your sources, and never be afraid to wonder what the first version that you can't see anymore because it has been lost to time, what that first version really said.